The chandeliers of the Rosemont dining hall shimmered like falling crystals, scattering warm golden light across marble floors, polished so perfectly they reflected every breath of movement. Linen tablecloths lay smooth and sharp-edged, wine glasses stood like tiny glass towers, and the dinner crowd spoke in low, effortless confidence, people who never worried about medical bills or overdue rent. Margaret Hale, a 62-year-old waitress who had spent half her life in service work, moved through that world with practiced grace. Her steps were quiet, her posture steady, her hands gentle. She wasn't invisible because she lacked presence. She was invisible because wealth had a way of blurring anyone who didn't belong. Tonight, however, the calm she carried into the room collided with a tension she hadn't expected. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's video, I want to thank you for choosing to watch my channel when there are so many other creators out there. Once again, I sincerely thank you, and I hope you can support me with a subscription and leave a comment with the number 1 after you finish listening to this story. Thank you very much. At table 16 sat a trio unmistakably belonging to the upper tier of American power. The elderly woman in lavender hair silvered like moonlight sat with a serene dignity. Beside her, a younger blonde woman in a red silk dress watched the room with the trained poise of someone accustomed to charity galas and press cameras. And standing at the end of the table was a sharply dressed man whose presence seemed to cut the air. Tailored navy suit, perfect tie knot, and a jawline carved from cold resolve. The billionaire's son, and his fist was clenched tight, knuckles paling with restrained frustration. Margaret noticed the moment the older woman tried to speak, her lips moving, her expression hopeful only to be met with silence and a dismissive shake of the blonde woman's head. The elegant matriarch tried again, confused, touching her ear with a faint wince. Margaret understood instantly. She didn't need words to recognize that silent kind of struggle. She'd watched her own sister lose her hearing slowly, painfully, year after year. Without hesitation, she stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on the older woman's shoulder. The elderly woman startled at the touch, then turned, and in that moment her expression softened. Margaret lowered herself slightly so their eyes aligned, and she lifted her hand to form a simple, graceful gesture. "Are you all right?" A gesture taught by necessity, used out of kindness. The elderly woman's face lit up, truly lit up, as if someone had finally switched the world back on for her. The blonde woman's brows rose. Several diners glanced their way. And the billionaire son? His eyes widened with an unexpected flicker of shock, then suspicion, as though he couldn't decide whether Margaret had crossed a line or filled a void he hadn't known how to approach. He stepped forward, voice low but sharp. "You understand here?" "How?" Margaret didn't flinch. She simply repeated the calm gesture again. Steady, warm, respectful, showing there was no intrusion here. Only connection. The room seemed to freeze. Forks paused mid-air. Conversations thinned. The hush that settled was deep enough to feel. The elderly woman reached for Margaret's hand, squeezing it with trembling gratitude. Her eyes shimmered, speaking volumes her ears could no longer hold. The billionaire's clenched fist eased, only slightly, but enough for the blonde woman to notice. Her gaze darted between mother and waitress with a flicker of confusion, maybe even fear. Margaret held her ground, quiet but unwavering, something dignified in the way she refused to shrink. She did not know that this one small gesture, one moment of simple human respect, would unravel a truth this powerful family had buried for years. And she certainly didn't know that the man in the tailored suit was about to turn his full attention on her. Not because she was a waitress, but because, for the first time in a long time, someone had reached his mother when he could not. The moment Margaret withdrew her hand from the elderly woman's shoulder, a thin thread of silence stretched across the table, tying each person into an unspoken tension that none of them seemed ready to break. The billionaire's eyes narrowed with a mixture of suspicion and reluctant curiosity, as though he were trying to understand how a woman in a crisp white apron had accomplished something he, with all his resources and authority, had repeatedly failed to do. The younger blonde woman leaned slightly forward, her posture sharpening as she assessed Margaret with a calculating look that suggested she was accustomed to guarding the family's image and was unsure how to categorize what had just unfolded. Margaret felt the pressure shift, the way one feels a storm rolling in over quiet hills, and she instinctively steadied her breath, reminding herself that empathy had never been an overstep, no matter where she stood or who occupied the room around her. The elderly mother gazed at her with a warmth that seemed to reach across every invisible barrier that wealth had constructed, her eyes shimmering with gratitude so pure it made Margaret's chest tighten in a way she hadn't expected. That expression alone told her this woman had been waiting far too long for someone to speak in a language that didn't rely on sound. The billionaire stepped closer, the glow of the chandelier catching the polished edge of his cufflink as he demanded, "Where did you learn to do that? And why hasn't anyone here tried speaking to her like that before?" His voice wasn't cruel, yet it carried a sharpness that revealed long stretches of frustration, guilt, and possibly a quiet desperation he didn't know how to hide. Margaret held his gaze with steady calmness, aware that the room had resumed its subtle hum, but still hovered on the brink of another silence, ready to fall again if she made a single misstep. She answered softly, careful to keep her tone professional yet warm, explaining that she had once cared for a family member who struggled with hearing loss and had learned simple gestures to ease moments of confusion or isolation. Her explanation was brief but sincere, and it struck the billionaire with a force she hadn't intended, because his expression shifted in a way that revealed a man suddenly aware of just how unprepared he had been to navigate his mother's silent world. The blonde woman folded her hands in front of her, masking her reaction behind a composed smile that didn't reach her eyes, indicating a mixture of discomfort and protectiveness. As Margaret prepared to step back to her duties, the elderly mother reached toward her again, her hand trembling slightly before forming a deliberate gesture that conveyed both gratitude and a quiet plea for patience. The small motion hit the billionaire with visible weight, and he inhaled sharply as though realizing he had missed countless opportunities to understand what his mother had been trying to express for years. Margaret gave a gentle nod in return, offering the older woman reassurance before turning away, but she could feel the billionaire's gaze lingering on her with an intensity that suggested their interaction had cracked something inside him open. Moving through the dining hall, Margaret noticed several diners watching her with mild curiosity, yet none with the sharpness of her manager, who stood near the service station with tightened shoulders and thinly pressed lips. He motioned her over, his expression taut with the usual fear that somebody of immense wealth might lodge a complaint, and he immediately demanded to know why she had involved herself so personally at a VIP table. Margaret responded quietly, explaining that the elderly guest had needed assistance, and that she had simply provided it with respect, a reasoning that should have sufficed, but did little to soften the manager's stiff posture. The blonde woman approached the service station with slow, deliberate steps, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor as she offered a smile so polished it felt like another piece of jewelry adorning her ensemble. She complimented the quality of service, but added an undercurrent of warning, hinting that the family preferred privacy and expected staff to maintain strict boundaries, her tone suggesting she was used to shaping social narratives before they could slip out of control. Margaret listened respectfully, acknowledging the concern while refusing to apologize for an act of kindness that had eased the elderly mother's distress. Before the conversation could settle, the billionaire himself appeared beside the blonde woman, his expression stern yet conflicted as he addressed Margaret directly, stating that he did not want his mother to feel dependent on strangers or overwhelmed by attention. His words carried a protective instinct, but beneath that lay a deeper vulnerability he was not accustomed to revealing, a raw recognition that he had not done enough to ease his mother's struggles. Margaret responded with measured composure, reminding him that understanding did not diminish his role but rather complemented it, a truth he seemed both grateful for and unsettled by. The elderly mother watched them from across the room with gentle awareness, her poised hands folded neatly in her lap as if trusting Margaret to convey what she could no longer express fully. Her gaze carried a soft strength that contrasted sharply with the polished hardness of the world surrounding her, and it became clear that she had long been accustomed to navigating social expectations without the benefit of sound. The billionaire followed his mother's gaze and seemed to realize for the first time how carefully she had been reading the room, relying on expressions, posture, and the smallest gestures to understand far more than anyone assumed. Margaret returned to her duties, moving between tables with calm precision. Yet she carried with her the weight of the family's shifting dynamics, aware that her involvement had stirred something deeper than a simple interaction. The moment between her and the billionaire's mother had been small, yes, but profoundly human, and it had exposed the fragile fibers holding the family together beneath their veneer of luxury. She suspected this was far from the last time their paths would cross tonight, and as she placed a fresh carafe of water on a nearby table, she felt the charged air settle around her like the quiet before a second storm. The gentle calm that Margaret tried to reclaim after leaving the billionaire's table did not last long, because every step she took seemed to circle her back into the widening orbit of the family whose evening she had unintentionally altered. While refilling water for a young couple near the window, she sensed a subtle shift in the room's energy, the way quiet conversations softened briefly whenever she passed, as if the diners were waiting to see whether her earlier gesture had merely been a fleeting moment or the beginning of something far more unusual. Margaret kept her chin lifted and her movements deliberate, determined to maintain her rhythm despite the lingering tension that clung to her surroundings like the faint scent of expensive cologne. As she adjusted a set of cutlery on a newly seated table, she caught a glimpse of the elderly mother attempting to engage with the blonde woman again, only to falter when the younger woman leaned away slightly, pretending to fix a napkin, while masking the discomfort on her carefully curated expression. The billionaire's mother touched her ear with a slow, resigned motion, a gesture so heartbreakingly familiar that Margaret paused mid-step, remembering how her sister had once mirrored that same movement whenever the world's noise slipped out of reach. The older woman's eyes shifted toward Margaret, not to summon her, but because she recognized a kind of gentleness in the waitress that the rest of the room seemed unwilling or unable to offer. A moment later, the billionaire rose from his seat with a frustration that crackled beneath the restaurant's soft lighting, his jaw tightening as he tried to interpret his mother's silent cues. His voice remained restrained as he attempted to connect with her, yet the gap between intention and understanding was painfully clear from the way her expression flickered with confusion. Margaret noticed his shoulders tense further, burdened by a helplessness he clearly despised, and for a brief instant she wondered how long he had been carrying the weight of expectations he couldn't fulfill. When the mother lowered her gaze and folded her hands neatly, the billionaire's composure wavered, revealing a sorrow he hadn't meant to show in public. Margaret stepped closer without hesitation, guided by the same intuition that had compelled her earlier to reach the elderly woman when no one else had bothered to notice her distress. She knelt slightly beside the mother, ensuring their line of sight aligned, and used another gentle gesture to ask if she would like assistance ordering or simply needed a moment to gather herself. The mother's response was immediate and filled with relief, her trembling fingers forming a grateful reply that flowed like a quiet river reconnecting to a familiar shore she had almost forgotten. The blonde woman stiffened, clearly disliking how the elderly matriarch reached for Margaret with a trust she had never extended toward her own family. The billionaire watched them with an intensity that bordered on awe, as though he were witnessing a language he had desperately tried to understand for years suddenly reveal itself in the hands of a woman he had almost dismissed a moment earlier. His mother pointed toward the menu, forming a short sequence of motions that Margaret recognized instantly as a request for something comforting, something gentle, something reminiscent of home. With a steady voice, Margaret translated the request softly, explaining that the older woman was asking for a warm soup because it eased the discomfort she felt whenever loud rooms became overwhelming. The billionaire blinked, startled by the clarity of the explanation, and seemed momentarily struck by the realization that he had misunderstood his mother's gestures for far too long. As Margaret stood to leave, the elderly mother touched her wrist with a soft yet deliberate hold, conveying a private sentiment that carried the depth of someone who had spent years waiting to be understood. Margaret responded with equal sincerity, offering a reassuring phrase through gesture that made the older woman's eyes well with quiet gratitude, as though she were finally being spoken to in a language she recognized as belonging to her. The connection was so tender that several nearby guests paused mid-conversation, witnessing an intimacy far more profound than anything wealth or social polish could manufacture. When Margaret turned toward the kitchen to place the new order, the billionaire followed her with measured steps, his expression shifting between confusion, admiration, and a simmering vulnerability he seemed unaccustomed to revealing. He asked, in a voice softer than before, how she had known what his mother wanted when he had tried and failed to understand those same motions countless times. Margaret explained that hearing loss often pushed people to communicate through patterns of touch, expression, and memory, and that the mother's gestures were less about words and more about feelings anchored in familiarity. The billionaire absorbed every syllable with a gravity that suggested he was trying to map his mother's emotional landscape for the first time. Back at the table, the blonde woman attempted to reassert control, speaking loudly and overly cheerfully, yet failing to hide her discomfort as the billionaire's mother reached again toward the chair where Margaret had been standing. The young woman in red glanced nervously at the onlookers, forcing a brittle smile, clearly realizing that the room now saw the waitress, not her, as the true source of comfort for the most important woman at the table. Margaret returned with quiet professionalism, adjusting the napkin beside the elderly mother before offering another simple gesture that asked if the lighting was too harsh or the room too overwhelming. The billionaire watched the exchange with a dawning recognition that the bond forming between the waitress and his mother was not a threat but a bridge he had never known how to build. As his mother responded to Margaret with a gentle laugh, the billionaire's expression softened into something almost fragile, as though the scene before him had peeled away layers of guilt he had not admitted even to himself. Margaret felt the shift as well, sensing the unspoken truth that this evening had already begun to reshape the structure of their fractured family dynamic. By the time she stepped away to continue her duties, Margaret knew with quiet certainty that her simple act of kindness had done far more than ease a moment of confusion. It had brought to the surface an unspoken truth, one that the family had ignored for far too long, and it had illuminated a silent world that only needed someone patient enough to listen without sound. The connection she shared with the elderly woman lingered in the air like a soft echo, drawing attention not through spectacle but through undeniable sincerity, quietly altering the course of the evening for everyone involved. Margaret barely had time to return to the service station before she felt the billionaire's presence at her side, his steps purposeful yet hesitant, as though he was torn between gratitude and suspicion while wrestling with an emotion he could not fully articulate. His voice, when it finally emerged, carried a softer resonance than before, restrained but undeniably earnest, asking her where she had learned to read subtle expressions with such precision and how she could understand his mother's gestures when he himself had struggled for years to interpret even the simplest movements. Margaret answered carefully, keeping her tone calm and steady, explaining that kindness often revealed truths the world overlooked, and that years of helping her sister had taught her to notice the smallest signals of discomfort, fear, or longing. The billionaire absorbed her words, with a lingering intensity that might have overwhelmed a less experienced woman, yet Margaret stood firm, maintaining the quiet dignity that had guided her through decades of exhausting labor and unspoken grief. He watched her with a gaze that attempted to unravel her story piece by piece, searching for hints of who she had been before she entered this high-pressure world of marble floors and polished silver. Margaret sensed the scrutiny and responded with a polite barrier, offering only what was necessary, because she had long learned that vulnerability was a currency powerful people often mishandled without meaning to. When she stepped away to retrieve a tray of steaming soup for his mother, he followed her with a silent question embedded in each measured step, his expression shifting between curiosity and an almost uncomfortable admiration that he struggled to conceal beneath his polished exterior. The moment she returned to the table and gently placed the bowl before the elderly matriarch, the older woman beamed with such unmistakable relief that even the blonde woman faltered, her carefully curated poise cracking as she realized she had been replaced by someone whose connection came from empathy rather than obligation. The billionaire's eyes softened at the sight, revealing a longing so quiet and fragile that Margaret wondered how long he had been waiting for someone, anyone, to bridge the widening gap between him and the mother he adored, but could no longer fully understand. As Margaret leaned slightly closer to the elderly woman, adjusting the position of the spoon to make it easier for her to reach, the mother touched her hand again with a tenderness that carried generations of unspoken resilience. The billionaire inhaled deeply, noticing the way his mother responded to Margaret with unguarded affection, and he stepped closer as if drawn by a force he had been resisting since the moment the waitress first knelt beside her. He attempted a small gesture of his own, imitating the motion Margaret had used earlier, but the execution was stiff and uncertain, betraying the awkward sincerity of a man attempting to communicate in a language he had only begun to learn. The elderly woman responded kindly to his attempt, yet her gaze drifted instinctively toward Margaret, silently requesting clarification. Margaret translated with gentle professionalism, making sure the billionaire understood the meaning while also guiding the mother's attention back to her son in a way that preserved the dignity of both. The blonde woman observed the exchange with growing discomfort, her polished smile tightening, as if she sensed the shifting balance of emotional power within the family, a rearrangement. She could neither control nor influence the way she intended. Margaret, however, remained focused solely on the mother, refusing to let the dynamics of wealth interfere with the simple humanity that had guided her actions since the beginning of the night. When the billionaire asked another question, this time about the meaning of a specific gesture his mother had made earlier, Margaret explained patiently, ensuring her words conveyed both clarity and respect, emphasizing that communication was not merely about understanding signs, but about recognizing the emotions behind them. Her explanation struck him with visible force, and he exhaled slowly, shaken by the realization that he had spent years interpreting his mother's silence as distance rather than the quiet yearning for connection she had been trying to express in her own unobtrusive ways. The restaurant's lighting seemed to soften around them as the billionaire stepped closer, his posture relaxing for the first time since Margaret had approached the table, revealing the exhausted son beneath the carefully crafted image of a confident man in control. His voice lowered, carrying a question that felt more personal than he intended, asking how she had learned to stay so calm in the face of emotional storms, and whether she had always been someone who noticed what others overlooked. Margaret hesitated, choosing her words carefully, because his question brushed against memories she had spent years burying beneath layers of quiet routine and practical survival. She admitted gently that life had taught her to watch without intruding, listen without demanding answers, and hold space for emotions others were too overwhelmed to name. Her words hung between them like a delicate thread, not romantic yet undeniably intimate, binding them in a moment of mutual understanding neither had sought nor expected. The billionaire inhaled deeply, letting her response settle through him, and when he looked at her again, something unspoken passed between them, a flicker of respect mixed with a subtle chemistry that neither dared acknowledge out loud. The blonde woman cleared her throat sharply, trying to reassert her presence, but the billionaire barely glanced her way, his attention anchored entirely on the waitress who had managed, in a single evening, to dismantle the invisible barriers he had built around himself. Margaret stepped back to resume her duties, but as she turned, the billionaire's voice reached her again, quieter this time, asking a final question that carried a weight far beyond curiosity. "Is there anything else?" he murmured with a sincerity that surprised even him. "That my mother has been trying to tell me, that I've been too blind to see." Margaret paused, her hand resting gently on the back of his mother's chair, and she realized that the moment had arrived where kindness alone was no longer enough. Understanding would require courage. She looked into his eyes, seeing a man no longer defined by wealth or power, but by the desperate love of a son who feared he had failed someone he cherished deeply. And with that recognition, she answered with a truth soft enough to soothe, yet strong enough to reshape his world. For a few precious seconds after Margaret offered her quiet truth to the billionaire, the air around their small corner of the restaurant felt strangely gentler, as if the chandeliers themselves had dimmed in respect for the fragile moment unfolding between a weary son and the mother he longed to understand. But that softness was short-lived, because the world of wealth and expectation rarely allowed vulnerability to linger without consequence, and the first sign of that truth arrived in the form of a sharply dressed man who stepped into the dining room with an energy so rigid it sliced clean through the atmosphere. His eyes swept the room with the precision of someone accustomed to managing reputations rather than emotions, and they landed on the billionaire's table with unmistakable urgency before flicking toward the service station where the manager stood anxiously straightening his tie. Margaret noticed the shift immediately, sensing that this newcomer belonged to the billionaire's inner circle, the kind of professional whose entire job revolved around preventing inconvenient truths from slipping into public view. The manager rushed forward to greet him, bowing his head slightly, while whispering a few hurried words that made the man's expression tighten, like a knot being pulled too hard. The newcomer's gaze traveled from the blonde woman to the elderly mother and finally landed on Margaret, lingering long enough to make it clear he disapproved of whatever connection had formed between the waitress and the family he was paid to protect. His posture conveyed a message without uttering a single word. Boundaries had been crossed, and consequences would follow. The billionaire sensed the tension as well, his shoulders stiffening as the man approached the table with an overly polite greeting, addressing him by name before explaining that he had received concerning reports about unexpected interactions between staff and family members. The blonde woman nodded in quiet agreement, adding a subtle complaint about the need for privacy and whispering that the older woman's condition should be handled delicately to avoid unnecessary misunderstandings. The tone she used, though deceptively gentle, carried an unmistakable condescension that made the elderly mother's face fall slightly, as though she had been reduced to a fragile inconvenience rather than a person who simply needed to be seen. Margaret stood nearby with a tray balanced carefully in her hands, witnessing the shift in power with a sinking feeling, because she recognized the pattern from countless service jobs where compassion was often treated as a threat rather than an asset. The manager's nervous fidgeting only confirmed her suspicion that he feared losing the restaurant's wealthy clientele far more than he valued the simple dignity of the elderly woman who had finally found someone willing to speak her language. The newcomer leaned slightly toward the billionaire, lowering his voice to suggest that the staff member's involvement might create unnecessary complications, especially given the mother's sensitive condition and the family's long-standing desire to keep certain matters private. The billionaire's jaw tightened at the implication, and for a moment Margaret thought he might challenge the man's assumptions, but the pressure of years spent navigating public scrutiny pulled at his composure like invisible threads. His eyes drifted toward his mother, who watched the exchange with a mixture of resignation and confusion, her hands clasping and unclasping in a gesture that revealed her growing distress. Margaret recognized the subtle tremor, the same one her sister used to have whenever conversations happened around her rather than with her, and it triggered a protective instinct that overpowered any fear of authority she might have felt. She stepped toward the table with calm determination, her voice steady as she addressed the newcomer with professional courtesy, explaining that she had assisted the elderly woman only because she had noticed signs of discomfort that no one else had acknowledged. Her tone was measured but firm, carrying the quiet conviction of someone who had spent years advocating for people whose needs were too often overlooked. The newcomer responded with a tight smile that never reached his eyes, suggesting that kindness was appreciated but procedures existed for a reason, especially when dealing with individuals who might become overwhelmed or confused in public spaces. The words struck Margaret with unexpected force, not because they were harsh, but because they reflected a common misconception that hearing loss somehow diminished a person's capacity for understanding or autonomy. She glanced at the elderly mother, whose head had bowed slightly in embarrassment, and something inside Margaret hardened with quiet resolve. She explained gently that the woman's discomfort came not from confusion but from being excluded, and that communication through gesture was not a burden but a bridge that allowed her to participate fully in the world around her. Her explanation was offered without defiance, yet it carried a depth that left the newcomer briefly at a loss for words. The billionaire watched the exchange with increasing tension, torn between the professional who had served his family for years and the waitress who had managed, in a single evening, to illuminate the loneliness his mother had been enduring silently. When the newcomer suggested that perhaps the mother should be escorted somewhere quieter to avoid further scenes, the billionaire's composure finally cracked, and he turned to the man with a sharpness that startled even the blonde woman beside him. He stated clearly that his mother was not fragile, nor was she confused, and that she had the right to enjoy a simple evening without being treated like a problem to be managed. A shocked hush rippled through the nearby tables as the billionaire defended his mother with a passion that hinted at long-buried guilt and fiercely guarded love. Margaret stood quietly at the edge of the table, witnessing the subtle transformation with a mix of gratitude and apprehension, because she sensed this confrontation was only revealing the first layer of a much deeper conflict. The newcomer stepped back with stiff professionalism, realizing he had overplayed his authority, yet he glanced at Margaret with an expression that warned her the matter was far from settled. When the billionaire's mother reached for Margaret's hand again, offering a small gesture of reassurance, it became clear to everyone present that the elderly woman did not see the waitress as an intrusion, but as an anchor in a world that often moved too quickly for her to follow. Margaret squeezed her hand gently, silently promising to remain by her side for as long as needed, even though she sensed danger simmering beneath the polished surface of the evening. And in that moment, she understood with absolute clarity that the biggest threat was not the newcomer, nor the manager, nor the delicate social expectations swirling around the table. The true danger lay in the secrets this family had spent years hiding, and the growing possibility that her simple act of kindness had placed her at the center of a storm that was only beginning to form. The tension that followed the billionaire's sharp defense of his mother did not dissolve into relief, but instead thickened into a fragile silence that stretched across the dining hall like a sheet of glass ready to shatter at the slightest touch. Margaret felt every eye in the room drifting toward their table, drawn not by spectacle but by the unmistakable collision of wealth, pride, and long-suppressed emotion that now hovered openly between the billionaire and the man who had tried to manage the situation. The newcomer recovered his composure with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to navigating corporate crises, yet the tightness in his jaw revealed how deeply the billionaire's reprimand had unsettled him. The manager chose that fraught moment to approach with a strained smile, hoping to smooth over the disruption by addressing Margaret in a tone that sounded polite on the surface, yet throbbed with barely disguised anxiety. He suggested that she return to her assigned section and allow another server to handle the VIP table, adding that certain guests required a more experienced approach due to their complex needs. Margaret heard the implication clearly, recognizing it as an attempt to placate the wealthy family while distancing her from whatever narrative had begun spiraling beyond the manager's control. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, the billionaire stepped between them with an authority that silenced even the hum of background conversations. "She stays," he said firmly, his voice echoing with the kind of certainty that made the manager freeze mid-breath. The billionaire continued, explaining that his mother was finally comfortable and that removing the only person she trusted tonight would be both disrespectful and unnecessary. His words struck the dining room with enough force to pull attention from every nearby table, and for the first time the manager realized he had miscalculated the direction of loyalty within this wealthy family. Margaret tried to intervene, gently insisting that she did not wish to cause trouble or disrupt the restaurant's procedures, but the billionaire cut her off with a quiet intensity that carried far more gratitude than command. He stated clearly that she had done nothing wrong and that his mother's comfort mattered more than any social expectations swirling around them. The elderly woman reached for Margaret's hand again, confirming her agreement with a soft gesture that carried profound emotional weight, her eyes shimmering with gratitude that no one else had managed to inspire throughout the evening. The newcomer stepped forward once more, attempting to regain authority, by insisting that the family preferred privacy and that reliance on staff unfamiliar with their preferences could complicate an already delicate situation. His reasoning was rehearsed and polished, yet it failed to account for the undeniable shift in the billionaire's demeanor, which had hardened from restrained patience into a protective resolve that bordered on anger. He demanded to know why assisting his mother was suddenly considered inappropriate, and why compassion from a waitress posed a greater concern than the repeated failures of those hired specifically to support her needs. The blonde woman attempted to intervene with a soothing voice, but her efforts were overshadowed by the billionaire's rising frustration, which now simmered openly beneath his controlled exterior. Margaret could sense the growing volatility, recognizing that the situation had evolved beyond a simple misunderstanding and into a confrontation over dignity, both the mother's and her own. She stepped forward carefully, placing herself slightly between the billionaire and the newcomer, using her calm presence to diffuse the tension before it spiraled further out of control. She addressed the billionaire gently, reminding him that anger would not help his mother and that the elderly woman needed reassurance, not conflict erupting around her. Her words softened his expression immediately, drawing his focus back to the only person who truly mattered in that moment. He turned toward his mother, who was watching the scene with widened eyes, clearly overwhelmed by the commotion, and unsure whether she was the cause of yet another problem her family had to solve. Margaret knelt beside her with quiet grace, offering a simple gesture of comfort that steadied the older woman's breathing and eased the trembling in her hands. The dining hall exhaled collectively, as though the entire room had been waiting for anyone, to reintroduce calm into the situation. But the calm was fragile, because the newcomer refused to relinquish control, stepping forward once more to insist that continuing the evening might not be advisable due to the emotional strain the mother was clearly experiencing. His tone, though polite, dripped with condescension, implying that the mother's hearing loss rendered her too fragile for normal social interactions. Those words shattered something inside the billionaire, and he turned on the man with a forceful clarity that made even the manager recoil. He declared that his mother was not fragile, that she was not confused, and that her difficulty navigating the world stemmed not from weakness, but from the failure of those around her to meet her with patience and respect. Margaret watched the exchange with a steady heart, recognizing the deep ache that drove the billionaire's anger, an ache born not from pride, but from years of watching his mother retreat into a quieter world because society lacked the willingness to slow down for her. The blonde woman tried to salvage the situation by suggesting they move to a private room, but the billionaire rejected the idea immediately, stating that his mother deserved to enjoy a simple meal without being hidden away as if her presence were an inconvenience. His voice carried through the dining hall with a resonance that silenced even the distant clinking of cutlery, and for a brief moment, every diner observed the family with softened expressions, as though reminded of their own aging parents or forgotten loved ones. Margaret sensed the mother's emotional fatigue rising again, so she placed a gentle hand on the elderly woman's arm and offered another silent gesture designed to calm and reassure her. The mother responded with a grateful smile that brought a rare warmth to the billionaire's face, momentarily dissolving the tension that had threatened to consume the evening. The newcomer realized he had lost the battle, stepping back with a stiff nod, though his eyes flickered with a warning directed unmistakably at Margaret, a silent acknowledgement that her presence had disrupted the careful balance of power he had been tasked with maintaining. As the billionaire returned to his mother's side, Margaret stepped away only slightly, knowing her role demanded professionalism even as her instincts urged her to stay close. The dining hall gradually resumed its rhythm, though the air retained a faint hum of unease, signaling that the confrontation had marked a turning point for everyone involved. The billionaire's mother sat with a peaceful expression, comfortably anchored by Margaret's presence, while the billionaire himself seemed caught between relief and uncertainty, unsure what the next moments of the evening might bring. And though Margaret remained quiet, she understood with unmistakable clarity that the conflict had not been about etiquette or boundaries, but about the deeper truth that empathy had revealed, because in the world of the wealthy, the simple act of caring for someone too often threatened the structures built to keep human vulnerability hidden from view. The confrontation settled into a brittle calm, leaving an uneasy ripple across the dining hall that seemed to follow Margaret as she resumed her slow, measured steps around the table, carefully maintaining her composure despite the weight of scrutiny pressing against her from every direction. She sensed the billionaire's lingering frustration, simmering beneath the surface, a tension coiled so tightly within him that it threatened to erupt again if anyone dared question his mother's dignity once more. Yet Margaret knew instinctively that another outburst, no matter how justified, would only deepen the isolation the elderly woman already felt. So she maintained the same quiet steadiness that had anchored the evening from the start, determined not to let conflict overshadow compassion. The newcomer stood a few feet away, pretending to review messages on his phone while casting sharp, evaluating glances toward her, clearly waiting for any misstep that might validate his insistence on removing her from the situation. Margaret felt the pressure of his gaze but chose not to respond, directing her attention instead toward the elderly mother, whose shoulders had begun to tense again as the room slowly regained its rhythm. She recognized the subtle tremor that accompanied rising anxiety, the same tremor that had shaped so much of her sister's life, and she stepped closer with a gentle intention, placing herself within the mother's peripheral vision to offer grounding without drawing unnecessary attention. The mother looked up with wary eyes, her expression carrying the emotional residue of the confrontation she could not fully hear but clearly felt, and Margaret responded with a soft, deliberate gesture crafted to reassure her that she had done nothing wrong. The older woman's breath steadied almost immediately, her eyes glistening with gratitude for the simple acknowledgement that the commotion had not been her fault. The billionaire noticed the exchange, his posture softening as he watched his mother calm under Margaret's presence, and he seemed momentarily humbled by the realization that empathy, not authority, had achieved what he had been unable to accomplish moments earlier. The newcomer, however, interpreted Margaret's approach as defiance rather than kindness, and he stepped forward again with a forced smile that concealed a blade-like sharpness. He suggested with exaggerated politeness that perhaps the waitress should refrain from further personal involvement and allow the family to regain their equilibrium without interference, a request framed as concern but clearly rooted in a desire to re-establish control. Margaret listened without flinching, her hands steady at her sides, her eyes filled with a quiet resolve that carried more strength than any raised voice could express. Instead of arguing, she did something far more disarming. She turned toward the elderly mother and repeated the same respectful gesture she had used earlier, slow, graceful, intentional, inviting the older woman to confirm whether she wished for Margaret to remain close. The gesture was simple enough for anyone to understand, yet imbued with profound dignity, because it shifted the decision back to the one person whose voice had been drowned out by the noise of others. The mother responded without hesitation, reaching for Margaret's arm with both hands and offering a gesture of her own, a small but unmistakable affirmation that she felt safe and understood only when Margaret was near. The entire table froze, including the billionaire, who inhaled sharply as though struck by the clarity of the mother's preference. The blonde woman glanced nervously between them, attempting to smile through her discomfort, while the newcomer's expression tightened with frustration he could no longer conceal. Margaret straightened slowly, keeping her movements measured and composed, allowing the silent exchange to speak louder than any argument she might have voiced in her own defense. It was an act of gentle defiance, rooted not in pride but in unwavering respect for the woman who had spent years navigating a world too loud to hear her. The billionaire turned toward the newcomer with a calmness so controlled it bordered on dangerous, reminding him that decisions regarding his mother's comfort rested solely with the family, and that his mother had just made her preference unmistakably clear. The newcomer attempted to recover by insisting that emotional decisions were not always the wisest, especially during public outings, but the billionaire silenced him with a single raised hand that carried the authority of a man accustomed to making decisions others were expected to respect without question. The blonde woman shifted uncomfortably, perhaps realizing her influence in the situation had evaporated entirely. Margaret remained silent through the entire exchange, her calmness creating a stark contrast to the tension swirling around her, and the subtle strength of her presence gradually rippled outward until even nearby diners sensed the shift. Her lack of aggression combined with her steady, empathetic composure became a quiet rebuke to the chaos that pride and fear had stirred only moments before. Instead of fighting for her place, she simply demonstrated it through action, allowing the truth to reveal itself in a way no argument ever could. The elderly mother, still holding Margaret's arm, offered another gesture, one so gentle and filled with gratitude that the billionaire's eyes softened with unexpected emotion. Margaret translated it for him in a quiet tone designed to protect the mother's dignity, explaining that she simply wanted to finish her meal in peace, preferably with someone who understood her without judgment. The billionaire nodded slowly, recognizing the depth of his mother's request, and he turned to Margaret with respect evident in every line of his expression, thanking her not with words but with a small, humbled bow of his head. The newcomer stepped back reluctantly, sensing that any further interference would only worsen the situation, yet his gaze warned Margaret that he was not accustomed to losing influence so easily. His frustration, however, did nothing to diminish the quiet triumph of the moment, because Margaret had not won through confrontation but through unyielding grace, proving that the softest voice could indeed shift the balance of power in a room built on wealth and dominance. Margaret resumed her place beside the elderly mother, adjusting a napkin and offering a comforting smile that drew a relieved breath from the older woman, whose hands finally stopped trembling. And though the restaurant returned slowly to its usual rhythm, Margaret knew that something fundamental had shifted not only in the family, but in the way the billionaire now looked at her, his expression filled with a new, profound understanding, shaped not by status, but by the unmistakable impact of a single quiet act of courage. The quiet victory of the elderly mother choosing Margaret over everyone else settled into the room like a soft exhale, yet it carried a deeper shift that no one fully grasped until the billionaire stepped back, watching the two women with an expression that revealed far more vulnerability than he intended. Margaret sensed the subtle transformation occurring within him, not as a grand epiphany, but as a slow, dawning recognition that his mother's world, silent, sensitive, and easily overwhelmed, had always possessed layers he had never taken the time to understand. His eyes lingered on the gentle way the older woman held Margaret's hand, her fingers curled with trust that had not been earned through wealth or influence, but through a single evening of sincere attention. The mother's posture changed gradually, becoming more open and relaxed, as if the presence of someone who understood her language allowed her to settle into herself rather than shrinking beneath the social pressure surrounding her. Margaret noticed how the older woman's breathing evened out, how the anxious flutter in her hands faded, and how she reached for her son with a soft, almost apologetic gesture, inviting him into the quiet space she shared with the waitress. The billionaire responded with hesitant warmth, lowering himself toward his mother with the tenderness of a child seeking forgiveness he wasn't sure he deserved. Margaret translated the mother's brief gestures, explaining gently that she had been overwhelmed earlier but felt safe now, especially because her son had stood up for her, even if the confrontation had left her rattled. The billionaire's face softened with relief, clearly moved by the reassurance, and he touched his mother's hand with a mixture of gratitude and regret, as though silently apologizing for the years of distance neither of them had known how to bridge. The elderly woman smiled, a rare expression that softened the fine lines around her eyes, showing that she understood more than anyone realized, and her smile lingered as she glanced back at Margaret with a warmth that seemed to anchor the entire moment. The blonde woman watched the interaction with a stiffness she couldn't disguise, gripping the stem of her wine glass as though afraid it might slip from her hand if she didn't hold tight enough. The power she once held in the family's social dynamic had shifted noticeably, slipping away from her polished confidence and falling unexpectedly into the hands of the quiet waitress, whose presence illuminated truths no one else had dared confront. She forced a thin smile, trying to mask the discomfort of becoming an outsider in a scene she once believed she controlled effortlessly, but the strain in her posture betrayed her growing awareness that everything had changed. The newcomer also sensed the shift, adjusting his stance with the rigid discomfort of a man watching his authority dissolve under the weight of genuine emotion. He hovered near the edge of the table, uncertain whether to intervene again or retreat before his misjudgment drew further criticism from the billionaire. The manager, meanwhile, lingered nervously behind him, wringing his hands together as though praying the situation would stabilize without requiring him to choose between protecting his employee or appeasing his wealthiest guests. Margaret remained focused solely on the elderly mother, offering another comforting gesture that conveyed reassurance and patience without intruding on the family's moment of reconnection. She adjusted the older woman's napkin, gently straightened the silverware, and placed her palm lightly on the mother's forearm, a grounding touch delivered with the same respectful delicacy she had shown from the moment their paths crossed. The mother's shoulders relaxed further as she leaned slightly toward Margaret, signaling not only trust, but a profound sense of emotional safety. The billionaire saw the gesture and seemed momentarily overcome, his expression cracking open in a way that revealed years of unspoken worry and unresolved guilt. He looked at Margaret with eyes that held gratitude too deep for language, recognizing her as the person who had finally pierced the emotional fog surrounding his mother, offering clarity where there had once been only confusion and solitude. A small breath escaped him, a quiet, unguarded release, as if he had been holding tension in his chest for far too long, and now, at last, found a way to let it go. He stepped closer to Margaret, his voice low and careful, thanking her not just for her patience, but for giving him a glimpse into his mother's world, a world he had struggled to reach despite every attempt to protect and support her. Margaret accepted his gratitude with humility, reminding him that the connection between him and his mother had always been there, waiting for a bridge strong enough to carry them both. Her words were warm yet grounded, spoken with the kind of sincerity that could disarm even the most guarded heart. The mother reached for her son again, her fingers forming a gesture that Margaret translated softly, explaining that she wished for him to slow down, breathe more often, and stop believing he needed to handle everything alone. The billionaire's eyes glistened with emotion, reflecting the glow of the chandeliers above them, and he nodded slowly, forging a silent promise to his mother that felt more binding than anything he had spoken aloud in years. The blonde woman shifted once more, clearly unsettled by the deepening bond she was witnessing, while the newcomer exchanged a wary look with the manager, sensing that the balance of influence around the table had shifted permanently and irreversibly. Yet none of them mattered anymore, not the discomfort, not the social expectations, not the frantic attempts to preserve appearances, because the truth had already risen to the surface in the gentlest, quietest way possible. Role inversion had arrived fully and unmistakably. The waitress had become the emotional anchor. The son had become the student, and the mother, the silent figure at the center of it all, had become the one guiding them both, not through sound or command, but through a series of fragile gestures that held more wisdom than any spoken word could carry. As Margaret stepped back slightly to allow the family space, the billionaire's gaze followed her with a depth that suggested their lives had crossed for a reason neither could yet understand. And though she remained humble and composed, a faint warmth pulsed through her chest as she realized that, for the first time in years, someone had looked at her not as a waitress, but as a woman who had quietly changed the course of a fractured family's evening and possibly their future. The tension that had once clung to the table began to unravel slowly, replaced by a fragile tenderness that settled over the trio like a soft veil, allowing each of them to breathe in a way they had not dared to earlier in the evening. Margaret remained close enough to offer reassurance without intruding, sensing the delicate shift occurring between mother and son as the elderly woman reached out again, her trembling fingers forming a series of careful gestures shaped by years of navigating a silent world with quiet resilience. The billionaire leaned in with a vulnerability he rarely allowed others to see, studying each movement with a sincerity that revealed how deeply he longed to understand the language his mother had been speaking all along. Margaret watched the exchange with gentle attentiveness, stepping in only when needed, interpreting each uncertain gesture with the same steady compassion she had carried throughout the night. She explained that the mother wanted her son to stop rushing through life, as if every moment demanded perfection, and that she wished he would pause long enough to notice the small joys she had been trying to share, despite her inability to express them verbally. The billionaire listened with a heavy mixture of guilt and relief, recognizing in her words all the silent pleas he had overlooked, while drowning in responsibilities he believed he had to shoulder alone. The mother touched her son's hand again, lingering on the back of his palm with a tenderness that carried years of unspoken affection, and her eyes glistened with the quiet sorrow of someone who feared her efforts to connect had been lost in translation. Margaret translated softly, explaining that she had never been disappointed in him, only worried that he spent so much time protecting others that he had forgotten how to protect himself. The billionaire blinked hard, swallowing the emotion gathering in his throat, and for a moment this powerful, influential figure, looked disarmingly young, like a child finally hearing a truth he had needed for far too long. Margaret sensed the heaviness settling in his chest and offered the mother another grounding gesture, subtly redirecting her attention so the son could gather himself without feeling exposed in front of the entire room. The mother responded with a small nod, understanding instinctively what Margaret intended, and she allowed her hands to rest quietly in her lap as a peaceful silence enveloped the table. This unspoken exchange between the two women revealed a bond deeper than any the evening had held so far, built not through shared history but through shared understanding of emotional fragility. As the room continued its quiet chatter around them, the billionaire sat straighter, his expression steadying as he finally allowed himself to meet Margaret's gaze directly. Gratitude radiated from him so clearly that it needed no words, and the faint tremble in his breath suggested he understood the magnitude of what she had done more deeply than he could ever articulate aloud. Margaret offered a gentle, composed smile in return, not out of pride but out of recognition that healing often began in moments when people felt truly seen, even if only by a stranger. The blonde woman watched the scene from her seat with a tightening grip on her wineglass, her carefully polished confidence wavering as she realized she had never witnessed such an intimate connection between mother and son, especially one facilitated by someone outside their social sphere. Her discomfort grew more apparent with each passing moment, because the emotional territory unfolding in front of her was beyond her ability to navigate or control, and for the first time, she seemed to grasp how deeply the family's dynamic had shifted. The newcomer, standing rigidly near the back of the table, sensed it as well, and his frustration simmered beneath his professional facade, though he wisely chose not to interfere further. Margaret returned her attention to the mother, gently asking through gesture whether she wished to share anything else, inviting her to speak in the language she trusted most. The older woman nodded slowly, forming another careful pattern with her hands, this one carrying a poignant mixture of sadness and hope. Margaret interpreted the gesture with the softness it deserved, explaining that the mother feared becoming a burden yet longed for more moments of genuine closeness, the kind she had begun feeling only after Margaret stepped into her world. The billionaire exhaled sharply, the truth striking him with renewed weight, and he reached for his mother's hand with a tenderness that made his voice tremble as he promised quietly yet earnestly that she had never been a burden, not for a single moment. His mother listened with wide, emotional eyes, and her shoulders relaxed as though a lifetime of unspoken fear had suddenly lifted from her chest. Margaret felt her own heart tighten at the sight, realizing she was witnessing a healing long overdue, one that had waited patiently for a night like this to finally unfold. She stepped back slightly, allowing the two to settle into their newfound closeness, but the mother quickly reached for her again with a soft gesture urging her not to go far. The affectionate insistence startled the billionaire, who watched his mother cling to the waitress with an emotional trust he had never seen before, and it left him both touched and humbled by the simple truth that connection often bloomed in unexpected places. Margaret reassured the elderly woman with a gentle squeeze of her fingers, staying close while offering space for the family to absorb the changes blossoming between them. The dining hall felt different now, no longer sharp with tension but softened by an undercurrent of quiet understanding, as though the very air had shifted to accommodate the emotional healing taking place at the center of the room. Conversations resumed, yet countless diners cast occasional glances toward the table, sensing that something profound had occurred, something raw, human, and deeply transformative. Margaret remained calm through it all, carrying herself with a steady grace that made her seem not like a waitress performing her duties, but like a guiding lantern illuminating shadows others had long ignored. And as she stood beside the family, watching mother and son rediscover each other through gestures more honest than any spoken word, Margaret realized that healing did not always arrive through dramatic gestures or grand declarations. Sometimes, it came quietly through a single hand resting on another, through the steadiness of a stranger's presence, through the recognition that vulnerability was not weakness but the deepest form of connection. Tonight, that truth had finally found its way into a family long fractured by silence, and Margaret had become the bridge they never knew they needed, steady, gentle, and quietly transformative. The fragile peace that had settled over the table was suddenly threatened when a sharp, dismissive voice from a nearby diner sliced through the calm like a blade, carrying the careless cruelty of someone who had spent far too long believing politeness was optional when directed toward those he deemed beneath him. Margaret felt the shift before she fully processed the words, sensing the mother's posture stiffen and the billionaire's jaw clench, as the man complained loudly that he was tired of people causing scenes over things as simple as not being able to hear. The remark, spoken with the casual arrogance of a person convinced of his own superiority, reverberated through the dining hall like an unwelcome gust of cold wind. The elderly mother's hands trembled instantly, curling inward with the familiar tension of someone accustomed to absorbing stings she could not fully interpret but felt deeply nonetheless. The billionaire rose halfway from his seat, fury flickering beneath his polished composure, though he seemed torn between confronting the offender and shielding his mother from further humiliation. Margaret stepped forward without hesitation, her instincts guiding her more surely than any formal training ever could, recognizing that the mother's spiraling anxiety would only intensify if conflict erupted too loudly around her. The rude diner continued muttering, unaware, or perhaps uncaring of the emotional harm his words had caused, adding that people with those kinds of issues should stay home instead of disrupting others' meals. His voice grew louder as he spoke, attracting glances from neighboring tables, some sympathetic, others curious, but all colored by the discomfort that accompanies witnessing an injustice unfold in a space meant for quiet enjoyment. The mother shrank into her chair, her expression folding inward as though bracing for a familiar wave of embarrassment, and the billionaire gripped the table's edge so tightly that his knuckles turned white beneath the golden chandelier light. Margaret inhaled slowly, understanding that silence in this moment would only deepen the wound already carved into the evening, and she stepped between the mother and the source of cruelty with the quiet determination of someone who had spent her entire life navigating moments where humanity depended on one person choosing compassion over comfort. She lifted her hands slowly, ensuring the mother could see her clearly, and formed a calm, steady gesture meant to reassure her that the cruelty directed her way had nothing to do with her dignity. The mother's frantic breathing eased slightly, her eyes softening with recognition as Margaret's gestures wrapped around her like a gentle, invisible shield. The diner scoffed loudly at the display, remarking that this kind of behavior didn't belong in a restaurant of such high standards, and Margaret turned toward him with a composure so steady it froze him mid-breath. She didn't raise her voice, nor did she let anger fuel her response. Instead, she simply translated the gesture she had just given the mother, explaining in a calm tone that the older woman was not causing a scene but merely navigating a moment of vulnerability with more grace than anyone else in the room. Her words, though soft, carried a weight sharpened by truth, and the diners around them fell silent as the tension shifted unmistakably. The rude man blinked, momentarily stunned by her controlled clarity, but before he could respond, Margaret continued, speaking with a tone that held neither hostility nor apology, only an unwavering conviction that human dignity deserved protection regardless of status or circumstance. She explained that hearing loss did not erase a person's right to occupy public spaces, that compassion cost nothing, and that the woman he had insulted had spent the evening doing nothing more disruptive than trying to enjoy a meal with the people she loved. Her voice remained gentle, yet each word struck with the precision of a finely carved truth, leaving no room for dismissal. The billionaire stared at Margaret with a mixture of awe and disbelief, witnessing her defend his mother with a courage and poise he had never seen from anyone outside their family. His mother's eyes widened as she watched the translation unfold, understanding from Margaret's steady presence that someone was finally standing up for her in a world that had too often demanded her silence. The blonde woman, who had earlier hidden behind composure, now looked openly shaken, realizing that Margaret's quiet strength was reshaping the entire room's perception of the elderly matriarch. The diner attempted a weak retort, insisting he didn't mean anything by it, but Margaret held his gaze with a firmness so serene it rendered excuses useless, her posture radiating the kind of authority that comes not from power, but from moral clarity. She told him gently that intent mattered far less than impact, especially when directed toward those who could not defend themselves as easily. The room seemed to exhale as the man sank back into his chair, chastened by a woman he had assumed was too insignificant to challenge his thoughtless remarks. The billionaire finally rose to his full height, no longer fueled by anger but by a deep, resonant gratitude that softened every line of tension in his face. He walked toward Margaret and stood beside her, not as a figure of power overshadowing a member of the staff, but as a son standing alongside the woman who had safeguarded his mother's dignity when he himself had faltered. His presence at her side spoke louder than any rebuke could, and the room watched in stunned silence as he acknowledged Margaret's courage with a quiet nod filled with reverence. The elderly mother reached for Margaret's hand once more, forming a slow, tender gesture that asked not for comfort but for acknowledgement of the bravery she had just witnessed. Margaret translated softly to the billionaire, explaining that his mother was proud, not simply grateful, but profoundly proud of the way someone had spoken for her without treating her like a burden. The billionaire's breath caught in his throat, and he placed a gentle hand on his mother's shoulder, murmuring a promise she could not hear but could feel through the warmth of his touch. As Margaret stepped back, allowing mother and son their moment, the dining hall erupted in a quiet wave of nods and softened gazes, many diners offering her respectful smiles that spoke of admiration rather than curiosity. The rude diner avoided eye contact entirely, shrinking into his seat as the weight of collective disapproval settled upon him. Margaret returned to her position beside the table, calm and composed, her presence once again anchoring the fragile tenderness that had been restored. And in that moment, everyone understood that the waitress had not simply defended an elderly woman, she had restored her voice in a world that had grown far too comfortable, ignoring those who could not speak loudly enough. The quiet that followed Margaret's unwavering defense settled over the table like a warm blanket, softening the sharp edges of the earlier confrontation and leaving behind so rare that even the staff paused to take notice, sensing that something fundamental had shifted within him. His mother leaned toward him with gentle pride, offering a gesture Margaret didn't need to translate, because the meaning was unmistakable. She was grateful, she was proud, and she had never stopped believing in him, despite the quiet distance that had grown between them. Margaret stepped back only when she felt the moment had fully anchored itself, allowing mother and son space to savor their newfound understanding. And as she did, she realized that this was the true beginning of the billionaire's redemption. Not a grand gesture, not a dramatic apology, but a quiet willingness to listen, learn, and finally see the woman who had been by his side all along. The dining hall gradually returned to its gentle rhythm, yet the atmosphere surrounding the billionaire's table felt profoundly transformed, as though the weight of years had quietly lifted and allowed something fragile and hopeful to take its rightful place between mother and son. Margaret remained near enough to offer support, while giving them space to savor the soft reconciliation that had unfolded, her calm presence acting like a steady lantern guiding them through the last remaining shadows of misunderstanding. The elderly mother looked at her son with a tenderness that seemed to shimmer beneath the warm chandelier light, and her gentle smile carried the unmistakable message that she finally felt seen, understood, and cherished without the need for spoken words. The billionaire held her hand with a reverence shaped by both remorse and rebirth, acknowledging the truth that he had allowed fear and duty to overshadow his ability to connect with her in the ways she most needed. He glanced toward Margaret with an expression that blended gratitude and humility, silently recognizing that none of this healing would have occurred without the quiet courage she had offered throughout the evening. Margaret met his gaze with a warm steadiness, not seeking recognition but simply grateful that the family had begun to stitch together the frayed threads that had once separated them. The blonde woman rose gently from her chair, her composed smile noticeably softer than before, as if she too understood that the evening had not been about prestige or presentation, but about remembering the humanity so often neglected in rooms filled with power. She stepped forward to place a respectful hand on the mother's shoulder, acknowledging Margaret with a nod that hinted at reluctant admiration, and then gracefully excused herself to allow the family the privacy they needed to finish their meal in peace. The newcomer, recognizing the shift as permanent, stepped back with a composed resignation, offering a polite bow before disappearing toward the exit without further attempt to assert control. As the evening drew toward its close, the billionaire turned toward Margaret and asked, in a softened voice, whether she might be willing to visit his mother occasionally, not as staff, but as someone who could bring comfort through the quiet language she so effortlessly understood. Margaret hesitated only long enough to ensure the mother genuinely desired the continued connection, and when the elderly woman formed an eager gesture of affirmation, Margaret agreed with gentle sincerity, knowing the request came not from wealth, but from genuine human need. The billionaire exhaled with visible relief, his expression brightening with the rare warmth of a man who had been given a second chance to rebuild something precious. Before leaving, the elderly mother reached for Margaret's hands, pressing them between her own with a fragile strength that carried decades of unspoken gratitude, and formed a gesture that Margaret immediately recognized as a blessing offered from the deepest part of her heart. Margaret translated the sentiment softly, explaining that the mother wished for her to carry kindness into every corner of her life, for it had become a light strong enough to reshape even the hardest truths. The billionaire listened with reverence, absorbing the words as if they were a vow he too intended to honor long after the evening ended. When the family finally rose from the table, the billionaire guided his mother with gentle patience, matching his pace to hers in a way that revealed how much he had already changed within just a few hours. Margaret watched them walk toward the exit, the mother leaning lightly into her son's arm with trust renewed, and she felt a quiet fullness settle in her chest, knowing she had not only served a meal, but restored something far more valuable. As they reached the door, the billionaire turned one last time, offering Margaret a grateful nod that carried the weight of a promise to protect the tender connection he had regained. And when the doors closed behind them, Margaret remained standing for a moment longer, letting the warmth of the evening's transformation settle into her bones, acknowledging that sometimes the smallest acts of compassion performed without expectation, agenda, or reward held the power to alter the trajectories of entire lives. She returned to her duties with steady steps, carrying with her the quiet satisfaction of a woman who knew that humanity, when offered sincerely, could rise above status, wealth, and every invisible barrier in between. Because in the end, kindness had spoken louder than power, and for one family guided by a humble waitress with gentle hands, it had finally been heard.